Do you think the Protestant Reformers would have major disagreements with modern Protestants and its various expressions? Yeah, generally, what people have to understand is that for Luther and Calvin and a number of other Reformation figures on both sides, the Lutheran and Reformed, there are certain conditions for them on what constitutes a church, called the marks of a church. Have to rightly divide the word, rightly interpret it, have to rightly administer the sacraments, and rightly administer church government or polity. Those are the marks of a visible church. So if Luther and Calvin were around today, the non-denominational bodies, they would not even consider churches. Those don't even count as churches for the confessional Reformed and the Lutherans. The Lutherans and the Reformed don't mutually recognize each other as true visible churches either. And that was true back then during the Reformation period, which is why in 500 years, they've never established intercommunion with each other. Because you can agree on certain doctrines, and that's nice, but in Scripture, the mark of unity is communion, right? So, and neither the Presbyterians or the Dutch Reformed on one side and the Lutherans, neither of them recognize the Reformed Baptists as true visible churches either. Nobody recognizes the Reformed Baptists as true visible churches on Reformation grounds. That's just in terms of what constitutes a church. Well, in terms of all the non-denominational stuff, the rejection of infant baptism and things like this, no, I don't think the Reformers would take them seriously at all. They would categorize them as Anabaptist freaks. Calvin was pretty clear with respect to the Anabaptists. The way you deal with them is you baptize them again by tying a rock around their neck and throwing them in the river. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying that was the attitude. Exactly. So, but we're in the United States, we're at a very interesting time, because what you're seeing the death of all the mainline denominations. They're going to be extinct. Within 10 to 15 years, there won't be an Episcopal church really anymore. There won't be a Presbyterian Church USA. These are all, we all predicted that this was going to happen with theological liberalism, and they're like, shocking, it's happening. The Seven Sisters, we're called the Seven Sisters, they're going. On the other end, with all the non-denominational stuff, where people fled to get away from the theological liberalism in the 1950s and 60s, and then the Jesus movement in the 1970s, they're fracturing. And you can see this, for example, with Calvary Chapel. Once Pope Chuck died, there was no mechanism for the succession. And so they all started fighting about the money and the property, and it all broke up. And so now what you have is really the realization of one sheriff towns, where the theology is whatever the sheriff says it is. There's no tradition to guide them. Now you have these kind of Judaizing sects that I'm seeing that are coming around. They're arguing for getting rid of the Epistle of the Hebrews out of the canon of Scripture. So now the canon of Scripture, even a Protestant canon of Scripture, is now coming up for debate. It's turning into the wild, wild west. So I don't think the Reformers, they would have none of that. Now, on the other hand, do I think the Reformers have a principled argument that they could sustain as to why that would be wrong? No, I don't. And to see this, there's a little book by Rupert Davies, who was, I think, a Methodist theologian, called The Problem of Authority in the Continental Reformers. It's a little book. It's only 150 pages. Get it. And you'll see exactly the problem. How do you know which interpretation of Scripture is normative and binding? He goes through three people: Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin. Luther's answer is whatever divides law and gospel properly. What the problem is how do you know what law and gospel is? Right? It's whatever you end up going. So it's circular. Zwingli has an inventive answer. He thinks God audibly tells him what the right authoritative interpretation is. Calvin believes it's this inner testimony of the Spirit. Well, how do you know who is elect and has the inner testimony of the Spirit and who doesn't? You can't. So this is why I say there's no principled position that the Reformers could take about modern evangelicalism or modern Protestantism being the wild, wild west. Do I think that they would condemn it? Yes. Do I think they could consistently do so? No.